Hello, and welcome to today's session on lessons learned from COVID-19's impact on academic, public, and to some degree private sectors. I'll begin by introducing myself. I'm Martha Crago, the Vice Principal of Research and Innovation at McGill University, and it's my pleasure to moderate this panel today of wonderful speakers. Let me introduce you to them, beginning with Muriel Alané, the Secretary General of the European Association of Research and Technology Associations. And then Penzhen Zhang, the Executive Vice President of Industrial Technology Institute located in Taiwan. Arthur MacDonald, a founder of the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory Laboratory and the 2015 Nobel Laureate in Physics. Snow Lab, as we call that laboratory, is an underground research facility focused on astroparticle physics, specifically studies of neutrinos and dark matter. And then finally, Sarah Pearce, the Deputy Director of the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation, Australia's National Science Agency, and Innovation Catalyst. So you can see our four speakers come from very different locations. One from a pan-European context, another from Taiwan, a small centralized country, and two from geographically very large spread out countries. So it'll be interesting to see how the experiences vary with that kind of geographic diversity. So let's get started now on looking more particularly at how collaborative facilities of the kind represented here today provide unique considerations for joint government, academic, private sector facilities. And we'll get started with some questions for our panelists. The first question I'm going to ask Arthur and Sarah to answer. What opportunities or challenges did COVID-19 provide for multi-sectoral collaborations, both new ones and ongoing ones that you might have known about? So Muriel, do you have some thoughts on that?
Do you want me to start? I thought that was Arthur and Sarah. Okay, well, that's fine. On pan-European level, maybe a little bit of history. ERTO is a network in Europe, but we also are managing RIN, the ERTO International Network. And we had, with the beginning of the COVID, organized a task force COVID, which we grouped the 350 members we are in Europe, plus the 10 worldwide with NRC, ITRI, and CSIRO here present. And what you could see is that the RTOs, and here Arthur will kick me and say, oh, you use 3 letters. So Research and Technology Organization, that's what we call RTOs, have been very active in probably not automatically completely changing their research priorities. And I'm sure that Penzhen and Sarah will come back to that, but more trying to find very fast solution to the very critical problems we had in the very beginning. So lack of mask, and how do you test the mask to be sure that they are safe enough? How do you find respirators? CSIRO did the first photo of the genome of the virus. So very fast to organize their capabilities in finding solutions to problems that we didn't know existed like a few months before. And using all their capabilities to do that. And in our task force COVID, we saw also a big exchange, and the international collaboration was key. And we had a lot of members exchanging their research in an open way, but not like a free bar. Sometimes we say open science. I always say, yeah, but it's not free. And what you could see is that it was relying on the trust relationship built up between all these research and technology organizations for many years before, where they could trust that if a result coming from one could be used on the other one, and they were trusting each other to give each other the results. So you had, for example, the 3D printing of a part of a respirator where you could hook from one respirator to patients. Yeah, that part was given only on a trust basis to the other, because you could be sued in case, one guy got COVID from the respirator and stuff like this. Imagine the legal consequences you may have on this. So what was invented was shared, but that came because of trust, and that came from years of international collaboration that were held by many programs. And I think that's what we saw during that COVID time. And it was quite amazing. And we still see results today.
Good. Art, as I call you, because I know you better than the others, can you give us an example of how you got involved in a collaborative situation?
Well, as you said earlier, normally what I'm involved in is very basic research. In fact, most recently looking for dark matter particles using liquid argon as a means of detecting them in underground laboratories, starting with an experiment here in Canada at Snow Lab, and most recently now working on the development of a 50-ton liquid argon experiment in an underground laboratory in Italy with 400 international collaborators. And very early in the pandemic, in March of 2020, the lead of our experiment, Cristiano Galbiati, was locked down in Milan, one of the early hotspots. And he realized that the technology we had been developing could very well be applied to the development of a new type of ventilator, a simple one that had relatively few parts, could be very carefully controlled with the microcontroller type of approach we take to our own experiments. And so he contacted me. I was able to draw in the national laboratories across Canada, the Triumph Accelerator Laboratory, Chalk River Nuclear Laboratories, and Snow Lab, and also academics across the country. We had a prototype working with a manufacturer in Italy in 10 days. We published it immediately. All of our work has been open source. Even working with the manufacturers, we want the world to have access to this simple and less expensive form of ventilator. At the same time, the Canadian government was moving very rapidly to try to expand the capability for manufacture of ventilators in Canada, because the type that are typically manufactured have thousands of parts and take a long while to try to gear up, particularly when you have restricted supply chains under COVID. And so they put forward a competition in which we were one of 4 successful companies that were supported. We received a government contract for this. Of course, when you're dealing with something that has all the extreme safety requirements for something to be used on a patient, it takes much longer. But it took on the order of 6 months to get full approval from Health Canada. We actually got approval from the FDA as well. And we have now supplied 6,000 of these ventilators to the Canadian stockpile, and discussions are underway for the potential to donate them to countries in need on the hopeful idea that Canada may not need as many as have been manufactured. But in the process, we were able to develop a Canadian manufacturing capability, as did the others who were contracted by the government at that time. And so both by being open with our design and also by this strong support from the government, and particularly by the national laboratories, in which the people involved immediately switched from their normal approach to things to working on this project, and did so willingly. Engineers who said, "You mean I can do something to help in this pandemic? I'd love to do that." 7 days a week for quite a while. And so it was a very positive response by the community. And it showed the capability that exists if you can mobilize a combination of, in this case, public, in the case of national laboratories, and also private sector in terms of the manufacturing companies as well as academia. So that's our situation.
Well, that's a wonderful story. And I love it that it went from underground right into the clinics. That's great. Okay, so let me move on to another question here about what long-term impacts this COVID-19 pandemic would have on the kinds of collaborations that got going. What are the new ways of interacting, whether they're online, how are networks springing up? So again, I'm going to go to Muriel because she's part of a wide networked group of nations in Europe to talk about that. And then to Sarah, who's in this wide, far-flung country. So Muriel, do you want to start again?
Sure. What we saw, so EARTO, we have about 350 research organizations. So you imagine the number of thousands of engineers and technicians and researchers which are working within that, let's say, capabilities. Yeah? And what you can see is that per topic, so per sector, people know each other very well, right? But when you come up with completely new topics that have to be pushed very fast, you can see that you need to use already existing networks to speed up things. So here in Europe, there had been a lot of discussion and funding coming from the European government to try to organize all the different European actors, and they used RDI projects and programs that were already in place to speed up. And you could see that the reaction of the EARTO network was very fast. So very fast, you had many new discussions on whatever you may think linked to COVID, from the vaccines to the mitigation of the effects, to tracing app, to I don't even know where to start. So many things were done, and it's probably the same in Canada or in Taiwan or even in Australia. And what you could see is that, as I said, it used existing networks. I think we have understood the value of past investments in that crisis. I think we see that the actors that have been supported with public funding for quite a while, should it be on the basis of what we represent on the more applied research world, demonstrated that if we didn't have that capabilities, we would be much behind today. And I think what you could see is that these investments allow the networks in place to be used. So Arthur didn't work with people he didn't know, but he used this past network in his example, right? And what you see is that this requires certain trust, and this trust takes years. And what I think, at least in Europe, had a lot of discussion was, well, this required and will require even more RDI investments than ever. And we have a lot of discussion, and we finished that discussion in Europe on what should be our future investment and the amount of funding that will go. And I actually think that one of the side effects of the crisis was the realization that for future economic recovery, only investment in RDI will be, out of the very acute crisis will be the way out. And I think you have an understanding on the importance of technology that we didn't have before that crisis. So in a way, it's a positive effect of this very hard crisis that we all live in. So.
Good. Okay, Sarah, have you got things to add to that?
Yeah, sure, Martha, thanks. So look, I think one of the things that the crisis showed us was how we can work across all different sectors to address a single challenge. So for example, our Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, which is one of only 6 high containment animal research centres in the world, it worked with the International Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations to conduct preclinical trials for vaccine candidates. We worked with the University of Queensland to do testing for COVID-19 in wastewater. We worked with federal and state governments on data dashboards. We worked with industry on developing materials that could be used for PPE, like face masks, and on a surgical face mask testing facility. And now we're embedded with CSL in Melbourne, helping scale up manufacture. So that's an agile manufacturing kind of model. And they're all examples of cross-sectoral collaboration in the face of a crisis. And so the question we're now asking is, how can we replicate this achievement in other areas like climate change and food and water security and getting to net zero emissions. So what we saw working really well, I think, was a strong network of organizations towards a common goal. And it's a mission-directed response, right? Mission-directed work is, of course, not new. But I think the pandemic has given us an extra focus to say, how can we work together in a similar way in other areas? Even before the pandemic, we had already been accelerating our efforts around 6 great challenges we saw: energy, food security, health and well-being, environmental resilience, industry innovation, and regional security. And I think what the pandemic has enabled us to do is, as we develop missions, and we have 12 missions now to address these challenges, say the only way we are going to do this is through these cross-sectoral, local, national, and international collaborations, getting research, infrastructure, industry, government, all working together in the same kind of direction. And I think that is what the pandemic has certainly shown us.
Well, I have to say, Sarah, that I'm very envious. I think we've been struggling in Canada with the fact that healthcare is controlled by the provinces, and how to bring all these provinces into alignment one with the other and get collaborative efforts that can go across them. We have recently, with the variants of concern and sequencing, been able to see a national backbone that went between 3 universities funded by our Canada Foundation for Innovation come to the fore and do a lot of move the sequencing scene forward for us. But I have to say, it's been a bit rickety as we moved to try to amalgamate the work of the public health agencies of the provinces and the data from them. So I'm very envious of all the data sharing. We finally got a good data portal for the variants of concern, but it's taken us almost a year into the situation to get some of that straightened out. So I think we need to learn from that how to work more collaboratively across our country in the future. Okay, so let me move on here to the next question. And this is going to go back to Art and Muriel. To what extent did the COVID-19 change research priorities? And do you think it will affect research and funding priorities in the future?
So in our case, it obviously changed our research priorities, at least temporarily. Normally, we work as as very basic scientists, but it didn't really change the way in which we do things. You probably may know that the World Wide Web was actually, the protocol for it was actually developed by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, the International Accelerator Facility, as a means for international scientists to collaborate over the web, as opposed to simply email prior to that point. But that's what we have been doing. That was around 1990 or so, and we've been doing that in our field for many years. And so these 400 scientists from 14 countries have been working over the web to try to develop the science. And we simply switched to using the same technique to cooperate in terms of this device that we hope would be of value internationally. And another thing that's characteristic of the way we do things is open source, and the attempt to avoid the restrictions that occur from, in matters of real need, that occur from patent protection and things of that nature. And I recently signed a letter with another, I think 100 Nobel scientists and others, to press for that to be the case in vaccine production as well. And so I think it may well be that as the world realizes that cooperation can be of value on things of worldwide concern, this approach of being open and making it open for everyone by making it possible for companies to produce anywhere in the world something that has been developed, which is the sort of thing we do in basic science, may perhaps be something that through the cooperation that has been happening during the pandemic, induces the world to cooperate more. And I think that's perhaps a lesson that maybe we across the world will have learned in the process of attempting to deal with this pandemic. And that's my hope as to how it's to some degree changing research priorities, but it's a little more changing the way we do research or the way we share research. And so that's a perspective that I obtained from our experience.
Good. Okay, Muriel, do you have more to add?
Yeah, I think I will. And this is I understand what Arthur is saying from, let's say, the more pure scientific environment. But what I see is also something slightly different, is that some of the government, especially in Europe, you have a lot more talks about technology sovereignty and making sure that you don't produce worldwide, but you have your industrial value chain, especially on vaccine production, also set up in your own country to make sure that, well, you can when you need, without depending too much on others for stuff you don't produce anymore. So I think collaboration internationally will also have a hit, and that we will have to fight to keep those channels open. In a way where we see a lot of discussions coming up with economic recovery, what type of industrial value chain should we keep in Europe and boost, for example. And what you see in Europe, I don't see so much a shift on the priorities, more question of speed, which is being asked. How fast should you do? And Europe stands a little bit between, China on one side and the US on one side, and you have a lot of discussion where we kind of pull between, and where we would still like to keep a certain openness with others and still keep a certain capabilities in Europe. And I think that what you saw was an increased renewal of thinking that we needed to have RDI investments in very big issues like quantum, AI, hydrogen, batteries, and others, which don't automatically link to healthcare, but link to when we recover, who will be the first to have stuff for the industry to be able to be on the forefront sometime. And on the technology, we see that much more. And there comes the discussion between open science for publication and information, and what do you do with scale up and maturation of technology, which is very hardcore to the RTO, the Research Technology Organization, which are member of the ARTO, to also support the scaling up of new technology in product of services by industry, to also make sure that your economy and you have jobs of the future. And here, what you want in science with openness is not the same when you want the implementation and the scale up of technology. And sometimes here you see you have a lot of discussion on that trade-off. And I don't think we have all the answers. And at least in Europe, you have a raging debate, especially between France and Germany, on should we talk about technology sovereignty, or do you want to talk about your autonomy, which is probably a little bit less protective? And how are we going to manage that trade-off with still keeping an openness and an open economy? And I don't think we have yet the answers, but I think that this discussion will last for a few years to come. And it will be interesting debates.
It is an interesting question, and there's a real catch-22, as they say, between these questions, because if you are not open, and if, for example, we solve the pandemic in our country and we have still a raging pandemic in Africa, then it's going to be extremely difficult to keep that pandemic out of our country unless we have extremely effective vaccines that also deal with all the mutations. And so really, this is a situation where we need to solve the pandemic for the world in order to solve it for an individual country. And that's something that I'm hoping will be an outcome of this pandemic, and that is international cooperation is essential for all of us in order to move forward. So that's the perspective.
And I think you will
that I
see
would
a
say.
difference, Arthur, between the healthcare issue, because we had the expressions already of the Ebola, for example, where all the Eastern, the rest of the world after Africa was a bit worried to see that also come to them. So I think people realize that, but I think healthcare, we have, for example, a completely new program coming on healthcare in Europe, which has just been decided last year, EU for Health. But we have also new program like on digital aspects, on defense and security, which we didn't have, not at the European level before. So you see that the health discussion, and I think on healthcare, the openness will be very different when you're talking to certain technology. And I'm curious to see how that will, fit and define the relationships we see with all our international partners. And what we see now, the discussion for the very big European program, the next one, Horizon Europe, the European government, the European Commission has started to discuss bilateral discussions with the member states outside Europe that were interested to collaborate, like Canada, with Eureka and other programs. And now we have the option to leave country out, even if we have a deal with that country to come into the program, if we feel that for our interest, and I say economic interest or technology sovereignty, we should. That was not possible in the last program. We were much more open. So, we are more open, but we're also more closed.
I'm really optimistic that the need for international cooperation is going to stimulate both the needs within, for example, Canada with its provinces and the European Union with its countries, and that will broaden to the whole world in terms of cooperation, perhaps on other topics like climate change as well.
Yeah.
So I think we can learn from this pandemic in many ways.
While I certainly agree, Arthur, that the pandemic has demonstrated how sort of internationally we can address major challenges, certainly for the Australian government, it has also demonstrated some of the risks of not having a domestic manufacturing industry in many areas. And so the Australian government, for example, is now has a modern manufacturing agenda. It's investing $1.5 billion in 6 identified priority areas. Because I think we saw as borders closed and countries became sort of a little bit more internally focused than we'd seen before, what Muriel was talking about in terms of sovereignty became more important for countries. And I think that has certainly changed some of the agenda in Australia.
Yes, I would agree that we have just tabled a budget in Canada, which has quite a bit of money in it for biomanufacturing, because we were caught in a situation where we couldn't make our own vaccines. And so we've had a slower rollout of that as we've depended on others. So I think there's this combination of how to catch up and how to stay at the cutting edge, and how to do that in a way that reflects some of the realities of what happens when borders close and supply chains become endangered. Okay, so we'll move on from there. And this is going to be kind of a double question, because Pei Zhen is going to treat us to some PowerPoint slides and answer 2 questions with the same set of slides. So let me articulate these 2 questions. One is, how can facilities be designed to be flexible, nimble, respond to changing mandates over time? And how are they organized to meet the current and future science and policy needs? And then the second question is, how has the pandemic helped to clarify priorities for research that relies on large-scale infrastructure? So Pei Zhen, we'll turn it over to you, and then we'll circle back to Sarah, and then circle back to Art. Okay, so take it away.
Yes, I will briefly describe our model. In the middle, what we call is a relay race model, or 3-stage model. In the middle, we call it technology building block. That's from technology readiness level from 4 to 6 or 7. That we will build up the technology module, or just mentioned technology building block. So actually in E3, totally we maintain about 140 technology modules with technical documents, equipment, and of course experts. Okay, and we use that capability to bridge scientific community and also industrial customers. Industrial customers on the right hand side, that lots of companies are domestically and also international companies, and academia is on the left hand side. So our model is 2 ways. One is we call it application focus, that the industrial partner that look for solutions, they talk to us, and we form a team to address their needs. And very often we also ask professors to join our team to provide a total solution to our industrial customer. And on the other hand, sometimes we very often team up with the professors. Yeah, pretty good. With universities, most famous university in Taiwan on specific areas to team up and to develop long-term technology. We have brain models, say joint development, facility equipment sharing, joint appointment. Say for example, before I joined E3 about 4 years ago, I was a professor in National Taiwan University, and NTU still keep my position. So I could stay in E3 for 4 more years. And after that, I have to choose whether go back to university or stay with E3, okay? So I just give one example. Next page, please. Say, for example, yes, we collaborate with National Chengkong University because we team up with them because they have a very good medical college. We team up with them to develop cell therapy and also computational medicine. For example, digital twin for cardiac surgery, simulation and prediction and classification of Alzheimer's disease. And also because we provide a facility that we have a small cell factory, GMP, good manufacturing practice certified lab, so you could produce cells inside the laboratory. Next page, please. Yeah, so actually in E3, we have a 10-year roadmap for our technologies. So we call it a 2030 roadmap. Okay, so we have all the technology we want to develop in for the future 10 years. But to be honest, that we have to revise every half a year. Okay, so it's we keep rolling. I mean, updating the list. Next page, please. So actually, during the pandemic, we quickly adjust our roadmap, especially to address the urgent needs. For example, so we form a team to reverse engineer a medical grade ventilator. Actually, the ventilator is actually the free license from Medtronic. That's SR560. That we have team to work on the document and to reverse to complete the prototype within 17 days. So that's on the left-hand side, that's the prototype we made in 17 days. That all the parts, because the time is so short, so all the parts were made by 3D printing, okay? And after that, we use the technology to transfer technology to a company, so they could produce the product. Next page, please. That's the second case. That's a nuclear acid detection system. Because originally we had a team working on developing a small PCR nuclear acid detection system. But originally they worked on flu A. But because of the pandemic, they quickly switched their subject to COVID. Okay, so right now the equipment is actually in clinical trial in US, Japan, and third country. Okay, that's just briefly share my experience. Thank you very much.
These are some really great examples of ways that people worked very rapidly. So nimble and flexible is, I think, a very interesting word there, and how your national facilities accommodated private sector and universities at the same time. And you see this coming together. And again, those of us who live in far-flung countries are probably envious of the fact that you are so centralized in Taiwan and are able to put people and things and organizations together so quickly. So Sarah, how about the flexible, nimble aspects of things in Australia?
Yeah, look, so there's two particular examples I wanted to talk about here. The first is the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, which I mentioned earlier, which was our animal health lab. And around 5 years ago, we sort of recognised, of course, that about 70% of emerging infectious diseases and almost all recent pandemics have originated in animals. And so we recognised really that we needed to refocus, to take a holistic view of human and animal health so that we could protect Australia from biosecurity threats. And so we changed the Animal Health Lab into the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness. And this really put us in an excellent position, frankly, to be ready for the kind of fast shifts we needed to make then when the time came for the next pandemic. The other example I wanted to give, not so kind of directly pandemic related, but you talked about Taiwan, of course, being a small country and Australia being very large. Our radio telescopes are an interesting example of where that kind of played to our advantage, because for a number of years, we've been moving to a remote operations model. So it used to be that our observers went to the telescopes to observe, but our newest telescopes are in very remote areas and we don't really want the observers to go there. They're radio quiet and the fewer people there, the better. And so we've been moving to a remote operations model. And so then when everything shut down because of the pandemic, that put us in a great position, because with just a few people on site, we were able to operate the telescope, but the observers could observe remotely as they always have been. And so we were essentially able to continue running all our radio telescopes all the way through the pandemic. So what we're doing now is we're having a look at those sorts of stories, and we're looking at a whole program which we are calling Labs of the Future. Yeah, and it's across kind of all our facilities and infrastructure. And it started as a property kind of question, but really it's turned into a much broader question than that, about how do we incorporate digital and automation into our labs so that we can do science differently, do things faster, be more nimble, use things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, big data, what needs to be actually in vitro, and what can be done in the cloud. And of course, what does this mean for our business cases as well? So can we open up our labs so that they can be used by research partners and industry and other collaborators? And what does it mean for the capabilities? Because in order to operate these sorts of facilities, you need, highly experienced technicians and scientists who understand the lab and who can support the users. And so it's a whole suite of things we're looking at now in our Lab of the Future program to say, how can we position everything to be in the same kind of position that the telescopes were when the pandemic came?
Boy, I think that's a very interesting way to reconceptualize how we think about these laboratories, many of which, become sort of the personal possession, at least in universities, of certain researchers. And they feel a lot of that this is their world and they're not necessarily sharing that world. And I think there's a whole different way to configure ourselves around the laboratories in shared ways, both between government laboratories, university laboratories, and those used by the private sector. So this is, to me, looking at labs of the future is probably what all of us should be doing to certain degrees and adjusted to our own settings. So I found that very interesting. Okay, so Art, you were going to comment on the question about how it helped to clarify priorities for research that rely on large-scale infrastructure.
Yes, I think it's interesting, and what may be a very positive outcome of this pandemic, if there is a positive outcome, and I hope there is, and that is the approach of government to science and science advice that they obtain. I think governments have had to be open to science advice. I think in terms of going forward, I'm hoping that they will be more willing to listen to academia, to their own government laboratories, and to industry as well, and not just to people who are interested in economic drivers on things. In fact, in Canada, there's been a great pressure from the economic side of things, in some cases to our detriment, in terms of ignoring advice from scientific committees they had set up that warned about the effect of the variants, which right now are raging in Canada. And so that's one point. And the second thing I'd like to mention in terms of large-scale perspectives of government is that we don't want to lose sight of the fact. I mean, I'm a basic scientist, and so maybe I'm saying something you might expect me to say, but I think it's true, and that is, I don't think we should not lose perspective of the fact that the majority of the things that we are able to bring to bear on dealing with this pandemic are as a result of the very basic genomic science that was done in the late 1990s and early 2000s in mapping the human genome in terms of developing very rapid genomic sequencing and things of that nature. And I think the governments are going to be pressed very hard to deal with things that are clear priorities, dealing with things like the pandemic, and they should. And I hope that, in fact, they'll get a perspective going forward that they need to be more prepared for things like this. However, I think also retaining their capability in basic science and listening to their advisors across the spectrum of people who have both basic and applied scientific expertise is something that I'm hoping will arise from this pandemic, that the perspective that the ability to cope really came from yesterday's basic science. And so that's a comment in general on the directions I hope things will take. Balance is important.
Yeah, I once had a chance to speak to somebody from the German research agency who said the best pandemic preparedness is investment in fundamental science. So I do think we have to keep things in balance here and moving forward together at the same time. So it's a good challenge for us. Muriel, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I find, you guys are very much on the basic science, but at the same time, if you don't have practical guys trying to find solutions that can fit today, you need the whole spectrum, I think, of investment. That's one. And I want to thank Arthur of saying the scientific advice, because I think it's right. And I think it's also more what we call the, solid policy making, which is also based on evidence. Sometimes, you have the economic sectors pushing very strongly. And very interestingly, 2 days ago here in Belgium, you had an open letter of the virologist, which has been giving advice on when to close or not to close the sectors and the restaurants and stuff like this, saying that if the government in Belgium was not careful, the next pandemic, they won't have any scientific support working for them, because he had to be slashed on social media. He has police escorts everywhere he goes because he's giving very tough advice, which sometimes go against certain, activities. He has a police which is car parked in front of his house for his family. This is the scientific advisor life. So he had to he made public the fact that if the Belgian government were not going to step up also in showing their trust in science and technology and all the, the chain, they won't be advisors ready for the job in the future. So I joined Arthur here because I thought that was very courageous of him to do so, because he's already very much on the news and very much attacked from some very specific economic sectors, especially Horeca and all the things which are closed now in Belgium for like a year. So you see that people are, for some sectors, are very much in big problem financially. So I think the scientific advising and the role of opening up not only to sectors, but also those who hold the labs, who have a view on the future technology, and can also sometimes push the industry to go further than the targets they are ready to accept from our government. That go, you know, the independent advising is necessary, but also need to be protected. And sometime I think in that pandemic, at least in Belgium, it just came out, well, they're not protected that much. So I agree with that. That will be another very strong point. Yeah.
I think there's actually a great partnership between basic science and industry, in the sense that when you have a breakthrough, cooperation then to apply that in industry not only produces the benefits you get in society, but also enables the next scientific breakthrough. You need the technology in order to make the next step in science. And so balance, as I say, is what is necessary. You need both.
Yep, the balance that comes together. Okay, I think we've got time here for a brief last question, which is, how are we going to take everything? People have alluded to this, but let's go back on it, because we do have to look for a day when we're out of this pandemic, but that doesn't mean we're not in the midst of other major challenges. For instance, climate change. So how does what we learned in this pandemic, how can we use that to address some of the other major challenges that we face as a global community? And I'll just open this up to you. Let me know if you want to have something to say about this. Muriel, and then—
And I go very fast, then Sarah and Payson take over. The speed, when we want to, we are capable of much more speed than what government ever thought we were able to. And when they put money on something, things happen.
Great. Payson, did you want to weigh in there? I think we'll give everybody a chance to say something about it.
To introduce the international network. Actually, the international network under EATO is actually chaired by Mitch, the president of NRC. Okay, because during the pandemic, actually we meet. We have several forums that we almost meet every other month to discuss the issues, to exchange experience. I think even though the pandemic is over, we still keep the operation that we could exchange the experience and ideas to tackle future problems and the issues. So I think that's a good model. So probably Muriel could introduce a little bit about the international network. Yeah, thank you.
Good. Art, do you want to say something about this, and then we'll let Sarah cap it up?
Okay. Well, I think I'm very hopeful that what we learn from this pandemic through international cooperation will pass over into future cooperation on things like climate change. In fact, I noticed that simultaneous to the activities in dealing with the pandemic and international cooperation, we're now beginning to see, at least in some areas, the greater awareness of the necessity to do something about climate change, more green energy focus. So I think that the more we can cooperate to solve this pandemic, the more we can give an example of how we can work together to solve other big problems that affect us all. And that's my hope.
Okay. Sarah.
So the point I was keen to make is very similar, which is I think the pandemic demonstrated very clearly how all the different sectors of the research ecosystem have their role to play, and how we needed both fundamental research and industry in order to be able to kind of deliver what we have, and both national and international programs. And so in our missions program, you know, we're working very closely with industry, for example, in hydrogen and in plant proteins. We're also looking internationally. So if we have a mission around ending plastic waste, for example, where we are working with China and India and Indonesia. And so I think one of the lessons I think we've certainly taken from the pandemic is that, in fact, we are in many cases all trying to deal with the same issues. And only by working in kind of large collaborative networks across all sorts of sectors do we really have any chance, I think, of being able to address some of these major challenges that we are nationally and internationally trying to deal with now.
So I guess what we're saying here to some degree is we have to get out of silos and we have to think about public science. And public science is undergirded by foundational science, but it also has a world of applications that reach out into the public and into public policy. And these poor public scientists, as you say, the science advisors, our public health people that have put themselves out in front of the public have sometimes had some very real threats to them. And this is the responsibility then of the public to understand what science is and why it's important and why we need to listen to it, even though it doesn't always accommodate our desire to see family and go to restaurants and have street concerts and so on. So,
and make a living.
And make a living. Yes, thank you for that, Art, because I think that's really important. So this has been a wonderful conversation, and we're now eager to hear questions from our listeners that they will be able to address to us.